always think it's important for people to really accept that the most important challenge is to be patient. There's no time. Some people might say to me, I've been not feeding myself, and all of a sudden, it's been 6 months since I lost mum, and my partner keeps giving me a hard time saying, it's 6 months, you should be over it by now. The person might say, well, I'm not over it yet, and so the person's expectation was that their partner was fine after 6 months. It's just not that person's needs or requirements.
This is At a Loss. I'm Timothy Giles. I'm a funeral celebrant, and I do this podcast to take opportunities to speak with people whom I meet in my work, and one of whom is Matthew Flynn.
Hi, Giles.
And I've met you in the context of your life as a specialist grief counsellor. So with the Grief Centre is one of the areas you work. And what does a grief counsellor there do?
Grief counsellors are there to really help people through the experience that they're having had some sort of loss in their life. So we get people to come in, spend some time with them over a number of sessions if they want, and really just see what they need, and gives us an opportunity for us to facilitate that discussion with people, facilitate the opportunity for them to just express how they're going, how they're coping, the challenges that they're facing with what they're experiencing, and really just giving them a chance in that kind of one-to-one context to just really feel comfortable and open up and really just tell us what they need, how we can support that, and how we can really help them find their own way to learn to live with what's happened to them. That's kind of the key aspect of the work.
Two things. One is I tend to overly focus on grief being related to death. But it's more than that. It's not always someone who's coming because they're recently bereaved.
No, not at all, Giles. We find that a couple of things there. Firstly, people may come in with having lost somebody, but around that loss, there'll be lots of other things that have happened to them that they may not have realised really amount to another kind of loss that has evolved because really the person they were close to has died, or they've lost a loved one's passed away. And that might be that, they've just lost their sense of purpose in life. They've lost their connection with other communities, their role in life. But in other cases, people may have just come along, not particularly because they've lost somebody or had someone pass away in their lives, but they've lost something else in their lives or lost other things in their lives. And good examples of that might be they've moved to New Zealand from another country. That's that we might not realise that, but I've done an awful lot of work with people who have come from other countries to New Zealand, and they've really got a sense of loss of identity, a loss of culture, and maybe the experiences that they're having here, they're not able to share in the same way that they would back in their culture.
Hang on, can I just, on that, we'll come to the other losses. Isn't that a bit ridiculous? I've chosen, you can hear my accent, right? I've chosen to come here. I choose to live here. I can't grieve the old country because I've chosen this.
Yeah, and that's a couple of things here. Firstly, a lot of people haven't chosen to come here. Refugees, asylum seekers, for example, coming here on a UN program, they don't even know where New Zealand was before they arrived. They don't have a choice. And we often might think, we'll ask them, why have you chosen New Zealand? And I long learnt not to ever ask anyone that, because they'll say, I didn't choose to come to New Zealand. I'm here. I've come from Somalia. I've come from Sri Lanka. I didn't choose to come here. So, but other people have come with partners. Their life circumstances have meant that they've just ended up in New Zealand. But even then, if people have chosen to come, like you just said, you've come from another country, you've chosen to come to New Zealand, what you might not have thought about is that you haven't chosen to abandon the culture that you've come from and the connection that you've come from with your families. And possibly haven't realised that in coming to New Zealand, there are things that are going to be different and that aren't part of your culture and that you're not familiar with. So there's a sense of loss, even though you've chosen to come here. And I've had this, many people have said this to me, I feel here no one quite understands me or gets me, even though I've chosen to come here and lived here for reasons that, everyone's got different reasons for. But, lurking an important part of everyone is, where they've come from and the cultural support they've had, so they can feel that they've lost that.
Yeah, and loss can be unexpected, right? And so I interrupted you and you were talking about other examples where you might work with someone through grief and it's not to do with death. Yes,
and that might be just a sense of perhaps they have lost their job, or somebody's come in and they've been in a position for a long time and they've really felt that this is an important part of their life. It's helped really define their life. And they've had a traumatic incident at work or something's happened and they've just feeling like they've lost a big part of them, which was defines. And I'll often hear this from people who may have left the workforce due to age. They've gone on in their lives and they've suddenly thought, I've worked for many, many years and now no one wants me, no one needs me. And I'm just sitting at home wondering, really, what does my life look like now? And there's a great sense there can be a big sense of loss around that, loss of connection with people, loss of purpose. People say, look, I used to get up every day, knew what I was doing, enjoyed my work, enjoyed my colleagues, enjoyed the role at the school or in the local community, all sorts of things where people have had a connection with. It may even be, on a community board or a part of a trust running something, and they've resigned from that through long service, and they think, I really missed that. And that's a sense, within that, it's a sense of loss of purpose and identity. And
so this is the third time you've mentioned those things, and what interests me, Matthew, is the grief the same? Loss of purpose, loss of identity, loss of the drive to get up and do something each day, and therefore the loss of social connection or the withdrawal. So is the grief the same, just the causes are different?
It's really difficult to quantify that, but what we can see and what people tell me is that they feel like they've lost something, and you might even think the expression that I often hear is, I feel like part of my heart's missing, part of my soul's gone, and that could be through all these different reasons. It could be.
Can I be blunt? You can't help. I've lost something. A part of my heart has gone. Well, you can't put it back, can you? So what use are you?
We can't necessarily fix that, but we can learn to live with that heart. We can work our lives into saying, yep, this has happened to me. I've lost my job. I've lost something close to me. I've lost my culture, but I can continue to live with that. I can find ways to feel as well as I can about that. I'm going to recognise it, and I also learn to recognise that at times that's going to be hard, and we can help with how can you manage the difficulty of that.
Despair. And I'm mindful of a conversation that we had where you were telling me about a man who lost his child. And I'm wondering, when you look at someone and you see them with such a profound loss, and why should I carry on, or how should I carry on? Do you see that often? And when you do, what's the approach? What helps?
Yeah, and Giles, many people will feel completely helpless, and despair is one word. They'll just sit there and they'll say, I feel like I've got no reason, everything's gone. Yeah. And what we often do with that is to really say to someone, well, go back to that universality of our experience as humans. We somehow have the ability to endure that. And one thing I've really noticed from the work is that we can endure. There's something about us from when we were first thought of as a species that allows us to experience really, really difficult loss. And I use the word pain as well. It's a painful experience for people. But somehow we can experience and endure pain so that we can find a way to continue our lives. Yeah, and it may look different, and that's okay. And it's important that people accept that if they have to, and then find other ways to continue their lives and live with that experience. So the work really, Giles, is how do we learn to live with what's happened? So if we've had a really situation which you might think is despairing, how could you go on? And I've heard stories where you'd think, gosh, how could it be any worse than that? How could someone have to endure anything worse than that? But people do. And one of the ways we work, and we can talk about this in a little bit of time, is the ways that we think about that relationship with what we've lost and how we can make more meaning of that, how we can look after ourselves.
Can you give me an example?
Yes.
Because I don't brain injury changed my life.
Yeah.
And I don't want a relationship with a brain injury. I'd like it finished, thanks. Yeah. I'd like my brain back. Yeah. So when you say have a new relationship with that loss, how?
Yes. Well, that's a very simple example, Giles, and people often say to me that one of the most helpful things they've heard reflected back is that they're always going to be in that relationship with what they've lost. For example, you've lost your father or your mother. I say to people, they may have passed away, they're no longer in the room with us, but they're always going to be your mother. They're always going to be your father. And this is just to give you a simple example, and you're always going to be their son or their daughter. Yeah. And when people hear that, they go, oh, I'd never thought of that in that way. So we think of loss as that's the end of it. Yeah. So we talk about really continuing the relationship with somebody.
You reminded me of one of the first conversations that I was lucky to have in doing At a Loss with a woman, Sarah, who her baby died in the womb and she carried full term and gave birth to a dead baby. And she still, years later, they had and they had a son who lived and grew, and she still says, I'm a mother of two. So you've said always that the daughter, she's always the mother.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I have many conversations with people about that. They've lost somebody, and how many children have you got? And I've got 3 children. One of them is no longer here with us, but I'm the mother to 3 children, and I always will be. So what we find and what we help people with is really establishing that relationship with what you've lost, so that you carry it with you. And a very simple example. I'll give you a simple example where a guy lost his brother. They were really close. It was his best friend, and it was his best friend in life was his brother. And he just felt lost without his brother. And I said to him, well, what we're looking at here is we're looking at ways to take your brother with you. Your brother's part of your life. He's always going to be part of your life. So why don't you visualize putting him on a backpack, on your back, and taking him with you. So when you're on those big bushwalks, you can imagine that your brother's with you. And he goes, I really see that. This is individual, but he said, I really see that, and I'm going to take my brother with me. So it's a bit like the woman who says, I've got 2 children. She's taking the child that wasn't born with her for the rest of her life. So that's what we mean, Giles, by taking and looking at those relationships and finding a way to, and I always like to kind of think, taking it with you in a way which serves you well for your life. Yeah, because we really have to, because we're all going to lose stuff.
Well, now you're talking about my emotional relationship life, but let's not, can we not delve into that for a moment?
How long have we got?
That's a change in the relationship from it being purely painful and just the loss into I'm turning my focus into the other things. You know, my brother died. It echoes with me what you were saying. And that man now is no longer just thinking about the absence. He's thinking about the things that still remain because of his time with his brother. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
So how long does it take? Someone comes in, I am not functioning in my life in the way that I want to, and I'm interested in the sorts of not functioning that you see when someone comes to get help. And then how long does it take? So what sort of, my life is not working because this grief is here, this loss is here. What does it look like?
Giles, that can be a whole spectrum of changes in your behaviour, which are all completely normal. And I think it's important that people notice that and be comfortable with that. That might be from a complete inability to do anything. Yeah, it might just be the whole system shuts down. It just says, look, for the moment, the news that I'm trying to cope with, this experience that I've had, has overwhelmed my usual ways of functioning, my usual way of coping. And for a lot of people, particularly where they've had the first significant loss in their life, they're just surprised or just totally unfamiliar with what's happened to them. So they'll find that they just can't do anything. They don't want to go out. They don't want to see their friends. They don't want to talk to their partner. They don't want to go to work. They just feel awful. Yeah, and someone said to me, they just feel really yucky, and that's normal because if you think about what's happened, there's been and this word comes up quite a lot too, there's been a seismic event in my life. I've been shaken up. So the first thing my body does is say, well, hang on, we need to go into a mechanism to just cope with that. How do we cope with that? And just how do we survive the immediate aftermath of the seismic event? And people have found it really helpful, to think of it almost like an earthquake sometimes in their life. And you imagine if you just wake up one morning and you look out and it's all gone. That might be your partner of 40 years, or it might be the job you've had for 40 years, or you've come from Somalia and just landed here, you've got no idea what's happened. Or you've lost a child. So that is seismic. So our functioning can be affected in every way possible, and it's normal.
That sounds like classic sadness. What about distraction or anger? Like, are there other behaviours?
Yeah, and I think even when we say classic sadness, Giles, it's sort of classic shock and classic trauma. This has happened to me. I can't believe it. I just can't believe what's happened. So that can manifest itself in all sorts of confusing and challenging thoughts. Anger's a really good one. I'm really angry that I went down to the dairy and left my sister, who I've been nursing for the last 5 years, and the very moment I went down to get a pint of milk and left her, when I came home, she died. And it can be very angry with yourself, and people blame themselves. I shouldn't have done that. It's really normal to go through all sorts of thoughts. I'm angry with the medical profession. I'm angry with the doctors. I'm angry with other members of my family. I hear awful disputes where family members really argue over the end of life care for their family members. So there's anger and resentment and just overwhelming sense of confusion. They'll blame themselves, blame others, angry, regretful. People say, I wish I'd said that, I wish I'd done that. If only, we hear that a lot. And there's all really normal things for people to be feeling. And it's just for people to realise, Giles, that's what happens. It's it's an overwhelming experience. And I think if you go back to the point that I made, which is it challenges our usual way of coping with life, then it's not surprising that we're overwhelmed and that our general way, we might be a highly functioning person, always on top of things, and then people say to me, oh, I can't even remember, my phone number. That's fine. That's okay.
How long does it take for someone who can't get out of bed, is caught in anger and destroying relationship because of anger, or caught in conflict around that? How long does it take for them to regain a healthy function and a meaningful a life that's actually happy?
Yeah, well, that's an individual experience. I've heard all sorts of time frames, and I always think it's important for people to really accept that the most important challenge is to be patient. There's no time. Some people might say to me, "Oh, I've been not feeding myself, and all of a sudden, it's been 6 months since I lost mum, and my partner keeps giving me a hard time, saying, "Oh, it's 6 months. You should be over it by now." And the person might say, "Well, I'm not over it yet." And so the person's expectation was that their partner was fine after 6 months. It's just not that person's needs or requirements. So for some people, I've heard people tell me it takes a long time to, fully assimilate and go back to that point about re-establishing a relationship which they carry with them. It might take, some time. But I think the key point is to really give people some hope that will happen, at some point.
What will happen?
They'll sort of start to feel that they're coming out of that, and that they're starting to learn to live with what's happened. Some people will say, "Look, I can't even accept my partner's died for months." That's okay. Why should you?
And you talked about regret, and I was listening to a lady today talking about she's really down on herself because of the conversations that her parent, who was elderly, like 90s, wanted to have. She couldn't cope with them. She didn't have them. Now mum's dead. And I'm a bad person because I right? How do you get rid of that?
Yeah, that comes up a lot with people. And the way that some people have said, and people find helpful there, Giles, is to make people realise that really while that was happening, at the time things were going on, they were just doing their best to be themselves. Everyone reacts differently. It often comes up over care. Did we do the right thing for mum? Should we have done something different? Should we have done this? Should we have done that? The way that we really settle that is to say, look, it's happened. At the time, and this really comes down to what we call permission giving.
Okay.
Giving ourselves permission to accept that all throughout that period or all that time, we were really just doing what we felt we would do, and if it wasn't perfect, that's okay. It's, we were doing our best at the time. But, because all those situations we find ourselves extremely difficult. There's no right way to behave for anyone. So if we say, well, I did my best, or maybe it wasn't perfect, but I was trying to be myself at that time, giving ourselves permission to accept that is really important for people, I think.
So you said permission giving, and it sounds to me like it's something consistent in your work of working with people.
Yeah.
So permission giving, how else is it helpful? How else do you use it?
Well, in the context of those difficult and challenging thoughts, that's where it's helpful for people just to accept that they can't change it. And it is what it is, So just accept that you were that person, and giving yourself permission. I find, and I think most counsellors will agree that, and most people probably will quite readily say as they do, we're all quite hard on each other, on ourselves. We're often our worst critic, and we're really hard on ourselves. And I don't. It's difficult to find the true answer to that. We all kind of are very quick, and most people say, "Yeah, I've noticed I'm quite hard on myself. My expectations are hard and unrealistic." So, giving ourselves that permission to be patient with ourselves as we try and change those things.
Even in that, I am shocking I admire and hear people who have compassion around themselves and who are able to forgive themselves and hold a love of themselves despite failing their own standards, failing other people. And I find it incredibly difficult. But in that moment, even with you just saying that, something feels like it shifts. Is the shift why you keep doing this? Because you don't just do one-to-one. You have a love of working with groups of people, right? So I'm interested in groups, in person, online. Why do you keep putting yourself back into the space of people where it seems to me to be an overwhelmingly and consistently negative thing? And yet you've had an entire other career which is available and open to you as a maritime lawyer, and yet you go and do this. Why?
I guess, Charles, when you say it's sad and seems a lot of despair, at the bottom of all of it it's the human condition. It's our lives. As one man said to me, when I was working in a refugee camp, and his father had died, and he said he'd never see his father. He'd never seen his father. He couldn't go to his funeral. He was as far away as you could be from his father. He just got news his father had died, and he just said to me, Matthew, as I tried to talk to him and engage him about what had happened, and he just said, Matthew, this is our lives. This is my life. And I thought there was something very profound about that. And he took some comfort from that. So when I'm working in this, working with people, this is our lives. So everyone I'm meeting, I've got my life that we're all trying to get through and experience these difficulties. But also, I guess what you can also see is growth in people. And this is potentially a strange concept for people to realise. But as I particularly say with young people I'm working with who've lost someone, maybe they're the only person in the class who's lost someone, the only person in the class who's lost their mother or their father, I always say to them, you're early into the club. The biggest club in the world is the club where we've lost somebody or lost something. Yeah. And by being a young person who is learning to see what life looks like and know that life will be okay without your mother. You'll be, and that's the key work with the young people, is that life will be okay. You'll be okay without mum or dad. He's always going to be your dad. She's always going to be your mum. But you're in the club, and seeing people, assimilate that into their life and grow as a human, because we all have to.
Is this why group then? Because one-to-one counselling is one thing, but you have a love of people working in groups, right? So is it that sounds to me like the club in action? It
is, totally. And for people to realise they're in the club and to realise they're in the same space and same environment as other people in the club, they're very helpful.
So can we talk about, what do you call them? You call them grief support groups? Like, what do you call them and what happens?
Yeah, we call them, I like to call them grief support groups, because really it's a group of people who have come together to support each other, to find that by being in a group, the collective experience of everyone together and what can come from the group in terms of helping each other is huge. It comes from within their own shared experience. They've all got a different experience, but they'll all soon realise that they've got a common experience of having had something happen which is challenging and difficult. And then, mostly in groups, people say, gosh, one of the things that mostly I've got out of this is just hearing that I'm not alone. Yeah. So feeling alone, feeling lonely from what's happened to you. If you've come from another country and you're here, people often say, I just feel lonely. I'm happy, I've got friends here, but I feel a bit lonely. So the group can really help people feel, often on one of the first nights, people will just say, well, I'm just glad I'm here because I don't feel like I'm the only person. So that sort of goes back to the key work, Giles, which is to convey and share with people and support people to realise that what they're experiencing is normal and it's what we're all going to experience in different ways, but the central experience is normal. So if they're feeling like they're not coping, don't worry. No one's really coping at all that well with it. We're all struggling to cope with it.
Does that happen in groups, that conversation?
Yes, yeah, totally. Yeah, it's very clear, as we all do. I'm conscious that most people don't come along to groups, and I'm just aware from conversations with everyone that it's not talked about as much. People don't have the opportunity to even realise that what they're feeling is quite normal, and other people may well be feeling it at the same time.
So this is whilst you've got expertise in this, and I know you've talked about refugees in here, but you've been in and worked in the places that refugees consistently come from, like South Sudan, right?
Yeah, South Sudan and Lesbos, Greece, big refugee camp there, and northern Uganda.
You're not, though, bringing your expertise and your years of working with people in grief. It sounds like you're getting a group of people to talk to each other, rather than you saying, well, actually, I've heard this before. Let me tell you a story that helped. There we go. That'll help you now. What's your problem? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. You're right. The purpose of the group, and really the way the people can work together, and whether it's in a group or just in their own communities, is to facilitate those discussions that they have amongst themselves. I had a group of young men come in who'd lost one of their best friends. 6 young men came in because they wanted to find somewhere to talk to each other. And when we started talking, they suddenly started to open up to each other, and they all said, well, I didn't realise you felt like that. I never knew that you felt this way about the loss of our friend. So just being there and having that opportunity in something that we just set up for them gave them the chance. But when they started to talking about, the most important thing that was going on there is what they are talking about, what they're feeling, what their experience is, and what they need from each other and what they need from life to be able to all live with what had happened in a way. And I think if we had a lot more of that, it would help. Sure. When you talk about a group, now I had a lot of experience around, stopping violence, anger management programs that were called back in the day. I think they call them something else now. 10 weeks, couple of hours every night, so once a week, right? That was the timing that made a difference. If I'm coming to a grief support group, how much of a commitment am I expecting to make to feel like it's helped me and I've made some progress? Well, we tend to run them for about 6 weeks. Some maybe between 6 and 8 weeks, a month and a half, couple of months, coming along once a week. We encourage people to try and commit to that. We run groups which we call closed groups. So it's the same people come every time. We don't have people coming and going from the group. So then that creates a sense of safety for everyone early on, that they are going to be the people. We have certain things at the beginning to create that sense of safety so that people feel comfortable sharing. But we've noticed that over that period of time, that gives us enough time to cover, quite a lot of the concerns that the group are raising. And going back to your point about whether it's how much is it directed, for me it's very much about what are the needs of the group, because everyone's different. And each group can be slightly different depending on what sort of losses they've had. So it's very important to cater really for what the group wants. And I will ask, what are the things that are troubling you? What's been difficult?
what should we talk about, and make sure we talk about those things.
And people are finding what they need or want from each other rather than from you directing.
Yeah, it's a little bit of resource, and there are some simple tools and strategies that we can introduce to help people with their with the way that they may go about doing that if they're a bit stuck in the group. But we discuss those. But for me, it's the most important thing is to ask the group, and one of the questions we're always going to be asking is, what's worked for you? Because that's for me the most important thing. There's hundreds of books on this and hundreds of articles, but when you ask a group of people, how have you coped so far with what's been difficult? It's amazing what resources people have had. But I think more importantly, Giles, is what people forget what they've got, what resources they've got. And the group can really help re-establish those so that people, going back to the point where they might just feel completely overwhelmed, unable to cope, whereas in life they've coped with lots of things so far. Helping people to reconnect with those core resources they've got is a really key part of the work, so that people go, I think by talking about this and recognising what I'm feeling is quite normal, and recognising that in my life I have been able to do things. I've loved somebody. I've cared for somebody. Those are big. They can be really big resources, which they've kind of been shaken apart by the seismic event, whatever that might be. So the group, by discussing it amongst each other and just being sort of guided through that sometimes to make sure we cover those and bring those out, can be really helpful for people.
6 weeks is quick. That's pretty impressive.
Well, it feels a good time, and groups sometimes people will come to other groups, or they'll often form relationships which they can continue outside the group. Yeah, and that's an important. 6 weeks. These days people are busy, we've got things going on, so it's kind of we're trying to use the time as well as we can without making it too long that people find it's quite difficult. People have to make childcare, all sorts of reasons.
And you said too long. How long is I'm turning up? It's grief support group. How long am I there for?
It's a couple of hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we always stop for a cup of coffee and a chocolate biscuit, because that's an important part of it, is just to talk, outside, just to meet each other and form relationships, reconnect. So that's a couple of hours session.
You used the word trauma earlier on. Now you use the term pain as well. Pain, okay, I'm familiar with. Trauma is a very high-profile word these days. I don't think I get it. Do you have a working definition of trauma?
Well, it's a word. In the context of grief, we don't hear enough about, in my observation. People think it's sad. It's sad, but trauma, for me, when I'm hearing from people, is that something has happened to me which has really shaken me up and challenged my concepts of coping with life. Yeah, I don't want to give it a medical definition because it's the definition I'm working with is what people have told me they are experiencing trauma. They have been going to a hospital for months, weeks, nursing someone who's terminally ill, or they've had to turn up at someone who's had a terrible accident, or they've just, they've been brought here from somewhere else, and they're just overwhelmed by that. So, going back to if you imagine if I was working in a group in Nepal where I was doing some work, and the whole village just woke up one morning and the whole village had slid down the hill in an earthquake. So every little house was gone. It was all in the rubble at the bottom of this beautiful valley. It was the most beautiful place in the world. They were all traumatized. What that meant is they got up in the morning and it was all gone. So everything that they had been comfortable with and enjoyed and had worked hard for was gone. So trauma for them was that sense of disconnection with what their world had been prior to that. So if you've lost, if you've been with a partner for a long, long, long time and you're done everything together and suddenly that person's gone, you can have a sense of your connection with the world has been kind of shattered or seismically shifted.
You talked about someone who has been caring for someone for a long time or visiting them in hospital for a long time. They die. Well, you kind of knew it was coming. Why are you so wiped out by it? Why is it traumatizing?
If you think about the requirements for you to look after somebody, the requirements for you to get in your car or get on the bus and go up to the hospice for 6 months every day and go in and have those conversations with someone that, we don't expect to have. To do that and to be able to get up and function is exhausting. And it's the body is having to find a resource to put itself through that. And that support the body's giving you is exhausting. It's using a lot of resource to do something that you don't normally have to do. So, you're busy, people have got a certain amount of energy, emotional and physical energy, and all of a sudden they're having to use it, maybe to care for some family member who's got dementia or Alzheimer's, and it's exhausting. So exhaustion goes with that. And I probably would say one of the first things I always talk about with people is how they're coping, with just the physical exhaustion. And most people will say, I just feel completely whacked, I'm just exhausted from the experience, from the grief experience that they're having. And nothing prepares them for that, that moment where they go into the hospice and the person's no longer there in the room. There can be a huge build-up of exhaustion, and they just, oh gosh, it's over, but I can't accept it, or I've put so much into this that I'm just feeling completely shattered by what's happened.
In part, I no longer get on the bus, get in the car. I no longer have that routine that's taken from me, which is disorienting in itself, I guess, as I'm listening to you.
Yeah, what do I do now? What do I go back to? And that's where a lot of people feel lonely. It's a word that comes up in my work a lot when we're saying what are the challenges and loneliness and exhaustion. And just for people to know that that's normal. A lot of people feel that way.
So there's the cognitive, the emotional side, but grief, trauma, it sounds to me you're working very much in a physical sense as well. Your body, my body is doing something to me that I don't control, and I just want my body to be normal and support me, but it's not. So that's trauma. That's that's part of the sort of effect of what the body's having to do to cope with what's happened to you. So your brain and your body are all kind of going, oh, this is all pretty challenging, Matt. Here's some resource to help you get through. And then often when it's finished, there's just a huge dip. And what we also find is that people may often find that shortly after they've had a loss, they're okay for a bit because they've got family, people are talking about who they've lost, or they've talked about, they're still talking about being at work. But then after a time, that all starts to fade away and people feel increasingly on their own. The family have all gone, they've flown back. They've sort of forgotten to stop asking you about how you're going. And this can be often, months down the track when it's more difficult than the original time. And a lot of people come and see us, after a few months. They go, I thought I was coping, but actually I'm not. And I just need some support. And I'm so, well, you're absolutely, that's good, because that's what most people finding. So good on them for, for realising that. And there's nothing wrong with that. So that's important for people to realise. And that's where I think that the expression being patient is quite important. It's something you don't hear enough. You often hear people saying you need to be kind to yourself, which is
which is, we all kind of know what that means. But I think it's equally, if not more important, to sometimes just realise that we need to be patient with that. Those people rebuilding their houses in Nepal, they're building it one brick at a time. It's not going to go up straight away. And they just say, Matt, we're just going to rebuild our house one brick at a time. So that's an analogy I often use with people when they've had this sort of trauma, is you're not going to rebuild. Just take your time. Take your time in the way that you need to rebuild that house.
For some reason, I find be patient an easier thing to tell myself than love myself, right? Mm-hmm. I can cope with that. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Well, that's good. And I think that's important. It is.
Because I'm being patient in the belief that it'll shift, right?
Yes. Yep. That's.
Some energy will return at some point. I might even get some drive back at some point, but not today, and that's okay.
Absolutely, that's okay. And people often say, life has lost its colour. The sky is grey. I hear that a lot. I feel like there's no joy in my life. And that's okay. But I'll challenge people by saying, the sky's grey today, and it might be for a few days. But if you look out, eventually you might just see a little crack, where the light starts to come in. Yeah.
Thank you, Leonard Cohen.
It's a great lyric. It's one of my favourite lyrics. It is. But it's the same, for people. And people go, yeah, you're right, Matt. The sky is grey. But
give me the lyric and tell me why you love it, please.
It's everything's imperfect. Everything's imperfect, but the light gets through the crack. I can't remember.
Yeah. The crack is where the light gets in.
Yeah,
right?
The crack is.
And why do you like it so much?
Well, we've all got a crack. There are cracks everywhere. But that's where the light gets in. That's the lyric, yeah.
But the crack is the fissure. It's the weakened part left by the seismic event.
Yeah. It might not be. It might just be that we're all imperfect. That's how I read that lyric. Charles, is that we're all imperfect, but that's where the light gets in. We need to allow that to come in. So when I tell people that story about the sky. It's probably the most common analogy is people feel like the sky's gone, life has lost its colour. So the work really is to help people start to colour that back in again.
Thank you for this conversation. It's not so much a mantra, but a message to myself that I can actually potentially cope with, which is be patient. I can probably be patient with myself instead of being quite as unpleasant to myself as I am.
Oh, I just want to mention briefly about the Grief Centre services, and that we are over on the North Shore in Birkenhead. And so if people need to feel comfortable in contacting the Grief Centre for support, individual counselling on any manner of things, and also keeping an eye out for the groups that we're running. We're really encouraging people to make sure that they seek help and feel comfortable that what they're doing is really normal, and we're there to support them.
The Grief Centre. Look it up online.
Thank you.
Closing thoughts?
What I hear in all of this work, Charles, is a sense of love, or araha for life. That these are stories of that, and why we feel pain, why we feel losses, because we've had a close connection with something in our life. And for me, that's kind of hopeful that as a species and as a human, we can endure that. So although it can seem really difficult and seem sad or despair words that you've used or traumatic, because of what we experience as humans and because of the love that we can share and feel for things, we're going to feel that, yeah. And I guess that's what I find is the most enlightening part of the work. It's all, all I hear is just beautiful stories of everybody out there tells a a beautiful story of someone that, or something, or somewhere, or something that's been a part of their life that they've been intimately connected with, and that they have, it's formed part of who they are. And someone said to me, our old dad he was a bit of a pain, but we loved him, and when I heard that, I just thought that sums it up, Dad was a grumpy old so-and-so, whatever, he was a pain, but we loved him, and we miss him, but we loved him. And for me, that's the important part, to bear that in mind, and that's what makes us human, and that's all, I guess, that's the reflection from doing all this work, Giles, that I probably think is quite an appropriate place. Yes.
Is it the grain? There's greyness, and the colour for you, it sounds to me, is that when you're going into, because I'm mystified that you keep going into this greyness, and is it that you're waiting to uncover the beautiful story because you will find there's always one there? Yeah.
I think, that's the human condition. That's just hear amazing stories of connection everywhere I go, and there's a beautiful, and I think there is darkness. My own view is that there is greyness. That's part of life, and in our culture, our world doesn't always readily allow us to be comfortable with that. There's a beautiful lyric in a song in Spain, which is "Gracias a la vida," thank you for my life. And there's a beautiful lyric in that says, "Thank you for giving me the ability to distinguish perfectly between the darkness and the lightness." And I think that's really important to be okay with that. And that, I guess, is what the work is. We can distinguish between the two. And that involves accepting that, okay, there is darkness. That's part of our lives, and it's kind of another topic again, Giles. But it just kind of a way to round out being okay with that, and then being okay with hearing stories, but realizing that where it comes from fills us all with a sense of hope and optimism that we can all endure this.
This is At a Loss, conversations about when the darkness arrives, being patient or hopeful to know that the light is coming. If you'd like to get in touch, then giles@ataloss.nz with any thoughts, comments or suggestions you have. Thank you, Matthew.